In this video, we are going to continue looking at GDP and Chapter 26. What we're going to be focusing on in this video is different ways of splitting up GDP. All right, so before we begin, this is going to be very important, especially later on. Right now, we're kind of just introducing it, but we will be using these concepts in future chapters. All right. Let's talk a little bit before we get started talking about these different ways of splitting up GDP, about why we might want to split up GDP. Right? The short answer is, well, the short answer involves stuff that we haven't gone over yet, but essentially when we have economic stuff happening and the government wants to try to do something to boost the economy, right, or to manipulate the economy through either, or usually through fiscal policy, then it's a good thing to know what areas of the economy are struggling, right? So if we're in a recession, the government wants to boost the economy by increasing government spending, right, or something along those lines. Knowing which sectors of the economy, right, are hurting the most, right, can help them kind of do more targeted things, right? If the automobile industry or sector is doing fine, then you don't want to give them money to help boost them, because that's not going to have much of an effect, right? If the cabinet makers are having a bad time, then you might want to send money their way, right? And that might have more of an effect, right? That's a very watered down, very kind of simple reasoning, right? But that is essentially why we want to split these up, right? So we can if we are going to use fiscal policy, which again we haven't talked about and we will later, then we can try to make it as effective as possible by targeting the sections of the economy that are lagging. All right, but enough about that. There are two approaches to splitting up GDP. All right, that we're going to talk about. I'm sure there are probably others. All right, but these are those, right, options, all right, or the two most common ways. All right, we have the national spending approach. This one is by far the more commonly used, and this is the one that we are going to spend the most time talking about. We're really probably not going to talk that much about the factor income approach, but we will kind of introduce it and talk about it a little bit. But the national spending approach is by far the more important of the two and the more commonly used of the two. All right, so those are the two approaches. Let's take a little bit more of a look on these. All right, so the national spending approach with the national spending approach is kind of defined or represented by the following equation. All right, y equals c plus I plus g plus nx. All right, so this equation is the national spending approach. All right, so we're going to talk about each of these things. So first, I'm just going to tell you what each of these things are, and then we'll talk a little bit more in detail about them. All right, so y, we're actually not going to spend that much time talking about it. Y is is your nominal GDP, not nominal. Nominal GDP, all right, which makes sense, right? We're looking at GDP and how we're going to split it up. So GDP equals all of these different categories. So Y is nominal GDP. All right, C is consumption, right, or consumption spending. I is investment spending. G is government spending. And NX, this is net exports. All right, so we can think of when we're looking at this national spending approach, we're essentially saying, all right, well, whatever we spend, however much money we spend, we must have made enough, right, to do that, right? Or kind of all the spending on all the products, right? Well, that's the value of those products, right? And that's what we're trying to get out of GDP, right? For those newly produced goods, right? So it is focused on spending, right? So let's take a little bit. Obviously, it's about spending. I wrote spending about 5 times, but let's take a look at these individual components in a little bit more detail. All right. Oh, it's really just to define these different things, but we do want to do that. All right, so some of them we're not going to spend a lot of time on. All right, so first, consumption spending. All right, so consumption spending, we can think of this as just kind of everyday private life spending. All right, so this is private spending on final goods and services. All right, so any private spending on final goods and services, that's going to go into consumption spending. All right, so whenever you go grocery shopping and you buy a bunch of apples or whatever, right? That is going to be private spending on final goods and services. That's going to go into consumption spending. Right, not a whole lot to say about that one. That one's pretty basic. The next one is investment spending. All right, so this one we are going to talk about a little bit. So investment spending is private spending on capital goods. All right, and that's not just really nice goods, according to a small British child. All right, what that is telling us. All right, so it's capital. We know what capital is. It's the stuff that we. One, it could be money. It could be kind of machinery, so on and so forth. And that's what we're talking about here. All right, so investment spending is private spending. All right, so spending by firms or individuals on things. On these capital goods that are going to allow them to produce other goods. So examples of what investment spending might be, right? Let's say you're a farmer and you buy a new tractor so that you can farm stuff, right? That would be capital, right? That would be investment spending, right? If a firm built a new office building, all right, for their employees to work out of, right, that would be investment spending. One thing investment spending is not is what we kind of more traditionally think of, right, or at least commonly think of as investment, right? So buying stocks, bonds, so on and so forth, right? Those are not counted, right? The reason they're not counted is because they don't produce anything, right? They don't create anything, right? Similar to when we were talking about kind of an old house versus a new house, right? Selling something old or selling something that's been used, right? Versus selling something new, right? When you're selling your old house, you're selling your own car, right? You're just transferring, right? It's what we call a transfer, right? You're transferring your car to the buyer. The buyer's transferring money to you, right? Nothing new was created, nothing was produced, right? The same thing with buying stocks, buying bonds, so on and so forth, right? All you're doing is transferring wealth from one person to another, right? Or really just swapping forms of wealth, right? Saying, here, I'm going to give you this cash or this, electronic money that the bank is going to send you. You give me this stock. right? Nothing new is produced, right? And so that's not going to be included in investment spending. It's not going to be included in GDP at all. All right, so again, that investment spending, that's on things like office buildings, delivery trucks, refrigerators for a restaurant, right? A big walk-in cooler, what have you. Those kinds of things, that's what we're going to be talking about when we are talking about investment spending. All right, the next one is government spending. All right, so government spending, this is spending by all levels of government on final goods and services. All right, so this one's relatively straightforward. When the government buys, fighter jets or tanks, that's government spending. When the federal government does that, when a state or county government pays to get roads repaved, redone, right, or a new bridge to be built, right. All of that kind of stuff, right? That is government spending, right? So spending by all levels of government on final goods and services, right? So any good or service that they spend money on, right? That's going to go into government spending. It's going to go into GDP, right? Once again, one thing that is not included are transfers, right? So it's like the battery's not included of this video, or really this chapter, right? Transfers are not included in government spending, right? As we're going to discuss in a future video, right, a future chapter, right? One of the major sources of government spending, right, at least on the face, are transfer programs, right? Namely, Social Security, right? The money that's paid out for Social Security, right, that is not counted. That is not counted in the government spending. It's not counted in GDP, again, because that's just a transfer, right? In the case of Social Security, right, the government is transferring wealth from citizens who are working to citizens who are retired and have gotten that retirement age to collect their Social Security check, right? So those are not included. All right, and then the last thing are net exports. All right, so the net exports, this is the value of exports minus the value of imports. All right, so again, what we're trying to do is get an idea of the productivity of the nation's economy. All right, and so we're saying, well, if we're spending, all right, if we're buying stuff, it must have been produced here, right? And this net exports is kind of a way to catch some of that stuff, because some stuff, might have been imported, probably was, right? And so we take that into account here, right? So one, we want to take into account the productivity of the exports, right? The stuff that's not going to be bought at home, so it's not going to get included in consumption spending or government spending or investment spending, because it's not being bought in the United States, so we're not taking track of that, right? We're taking care of it right here, right? All right, what's the value of, what are the productivity that we're sending to other people, right? Then we also have to take into account that we didn't make everything that we consumed, right? We did have some imports, so we need to remove the value of those imports so that we don't kind of overcount and kind of overstate our productivity level. All right, but those are the kind of elements of the national spending approach. Once again, these are going to be very important later on. We're going to be using these quite a lot, especially when we get to, I believe it's chapter 32, when we start talking about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, right? And especially when we get to our discussions on fiscal policy in chapter 34, 35, something like that. But that's it for now, all right? But those are the those different components, right? A way that these might pop up on homeworks or tests. All right, I might just ask you, hey, what does net exports mean? All right, I might ask you, give you a list of things and their value. All right, I believe on one paper homework I gave out in previous semesters, it was $40 million worth of Moroccan fezzes, right? Might give you a bunch of different goods, all right? Ask you to categorize them, right? Which one of these would they fall into, if they fall into any, right? And then use that information to calculate a GDP, right? But that is essentially it for that national spending approach. So let's move on to the factor income approach. Again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time. That's not how you spell that. All right, so factor income approach. This one, kind of the difference between this and the national spending approach, well, there are probably a lot of differences, but one of the big ones is that the national spending approach focuses on spending, right? The factor income approach focuses on receiving, right? So national spending approach, spending money, right? That's how we're going to find out the productivity level of the economy, right? Factor income approach, it's about receiving money to find out how productive the economy is. All right, so I'm probably not going to fit this all on one line because it's not just letters, it's actual words, right? But we're going to have, it's also going to be represented by an equation. So once again, we have the Y, that's our GDP, right? So our GDP is going to be our employee compensation. So wages or salaries along with, the value of vacation days and health insurance and all of that kind of stuff, right? So, so that employee compensation, right? Kind of getting, how productive, right? What's the productivity level of everyone kind of working, right? Then plus rent, so kind of the productivity of providing a space for somebody to do something, right? Then interest on loans, and then profit as well. All right, so again, this is kind of taking track of kind of the productivity, right, by looking at how much money has been received by members of the economy. All right, again, that's really all we're going to say about this one. It's not going to pop up that often. I mean, it would not surprise me if this was the first and last time you ever heard about this or saw it. But there is another way of kind of splitting up GDP, right? And it is the factor income approach. All right, so that does it for this video. In the next video, we're going to look at some of the problems that GDP has as a measure of output and welfare. Right? So in a previous video, I kind of mentioned that there are some problems. It's a very good measure. GDP's really good and it's really useful. Right? It's one of the best that we have, especially for this. That's why it's used so commonly. Right? But there are some problems with it, and we're going to discuss those in the next video. All right, I will see you then.